Welcome to the Q&A series with Jill Eng, Mindful Reality. These are specific questions asked by real people, answered through the lens of this practice. I also offer coaching sessions in this work, as well as the opportunity to purchase personalized recorded responses to your own questions through private recordings. Please refer to the website for more information on both these services. Okay, today I have a question from Charlotte who says, I feel a lot of resistance to my feelings that I can't even name. What are your thoughts? So this is an interesting question for me to address because it overlaps the two bodies of work that I am involved with. One is this one here, Mindful Reality, which is something I have developed and written about in my books and use for myself as an emotional relief technique. But it stems from all of the work I have been immersed in over many, many years, many of which are Eastern-based, as well as the work of people like Byron Katie and Eckhart Tolle, but equally so the work of F.M. Alexander, as I am a teacher in the Alexander technique. And the Alexander technique is, in fact, a psychophysical awareness technique. It has a psychophysical component that makes sense in relation to the question that Charlotte has asked. So let's just start there for the moment, and then we'll backtrack. So in the Alexander technique, we learn how the organism, the body, is prone to a kind of contraction, a muscular contraction, kind of what feels like an inner preparation or a fight or flight status in reaction to all stimulation, whether it is having to get out of a chair or picking something up or, the phone ringing and somebody anticipating that it's somebody they don't want to talk to, when we get yelled at, really everything and anything, a thought, any kind of thought. A thought that is painful, a thought that we have to do something. If you notice in your day, and particularly an Alexander teacher will bring your attention to this, there is this muscular pickup, like a muscular setup that basically is just a squeezing of one's own skeleton. We have layers of muscle strapped over our skeletal structure. And when we're very, very young, there's no contraction. Or a child perhaps, or like any other animal, might tense up for the moment, but then come out of it. And what is very particular about the education in Alexander's work is the tension around the head and the neck and the torso, particularly the skull-spine relationship. That tends to tighten all the neck and back muscles in a way that feels so familiar that we would never even question it. So it is not my intention here to go into the Alexander technique, but because it ties in so well with this question about resistance, I do feel the need to address it, especially because it has informed me so much in my development of this work I call Mindful Reality. But let's go back to Charlotte's question. So Charlotte says, I feel a lot of resistance to my feelings that I can't even name. I mean, this is a great question because it is so loaded and it is so part of what we are dealing with all the time in terms of our feelings emotionally. Because most of us, if not many of us, walk around with a general dis-ease, something I talk about all the time in this work, a general dis-ease of wanting or emotional pain or painful waiting. And what is that feeling? Now, maybe I'm getting off on a tangent here because Charlotte's question doesn't talk about wanting or waiting or those kind of things. But I think they're tied in. In any case, so a resistance to my feelings. For me, that sounds like there's a sense, especially because Charlotte says feelings that I can't even name. So there's a sense that there is something that Charlotte is afraid to face, something that she senses is emotionally existing somewhere in her psyche, in her mind somewhere, that she senses would be painful if she had to acknowledge or address. Now, again, this is a very loaded and broad kind of question because it will hit people in many different ways. I mean, there is absolutely the reality that sometimes there are things that we have experienced in our life, whether it's some kind of trauma that we underwent when we were very young, and our brains have a way of blocking that information to our conscious mind. So we're left with some kind of wariness or fear or sense like something happened to me and I don't know what that is, but it's lurking around in the background of my thoughts and I can't quite get at it, but I nevertheless feel like I'm resisting it. This is what Charlotte's question makes me think of. So this is absolutely very common and accurate. There are things that we go through when we're young, as an example, because of course, traumatic events can occur at any time in our lives. And our bodies have ways, and when I say body, I mean the whole organism. I'm including the brain and the emotions and the psychological components when I say body. Or when the organism has ways of blocking memory in order to protect us, because sometimes, obviously, it would be too painful to acknowledge the event in its entirety, right? I mean, this is very typical when people are traumatized in many, 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 many different ways, whether it's domestic abuse or rape, physical violence, or just emotional violence. If we've had parents or people treating us in a certain way repeatedly, that is just too horrifying and shocking for the person to consciously acknowledge. Instead, there is a kind of blocking of information that goes on. Nevertheless, the organism is still undergoing some kind of anxiety. Now, I am not a doctor and I am not a psychotherapist or any kind of counselor in that way, though I do have a good amount of experience for myself in psychotherapy, different kinds, and I have read a lot, but I am not giving information here that is based in any kind of certification. Nevertheless, absolutely, there are various kinds of traumas that we have gone through that sometimes don't surface mentally, consciously, until years down the road. Now, I have no idea if this has anything to do with anything that Charlotte is asking about, and it's even possible Charlotte would not know, right? Because sometimes we do block these things out. But I'm just going to address the feeling of resistance itself. And also for the purpose that is not particularly psychological. And so it is another way to play around with coming out of resistance and seeing how the resistance itself, or the feeling of resistance itself, is nothing to fear and may give some insight into what happens underneath that tension. This is nothing to fear because, as they say, the only thing to fear is fear itself, because in the way I see it, through my training in the Alexander technique, as well as my work in this body of work, mindful reality, tension, whether you're sensing it on a muscular level or an emotional level, is really just a muscular contraction. Even if it's just something on a psychological level, emotional level, it still is just muscular contraction. And when you come out of the muscular contraction, you see, in fact, that you are okay. Because if it is true that one feels like they are resisting feelings, and perhaps feelings that they sense, well, maybe there's a reason I'm resisting these feelings because they are just generally too painful to even conceive of, whatever that would be is something that occurred in the past and it's over. And that's why it's safe to come out of the muscular contraction that perhaps is really all someone is feeling. And I want to go with this word feeling for a moment. And this is something that my Alexander teacher had mentioned to me we're talking now, my training was back in the 1990s, but the word feeling, the only thing you can really feel are your muscles. This is, again, maybe it is counterintuitive, and it might be counter to the way people generally think of things psychologically and emotionally. But let's give it a try. So feeling comes through muscles. So if you think of yourself as a skeleton, right, a full body, a skeletal structure, a skeleton on a surface is what I always say. We are a skeleton on a surface at all times. You are a full whole body, head included, a simple structure that never changes, and you're on some surface, always, 100% of the time. And this is not what it feels like. And I talk about this a lot in my books. It's not what it feels like. We live so much in our thought processes and in our head, as they say, that we are not aware of the fact that we are always present in the space, meaning always physically existing, always a whole body, even if we feel kind of disjointed and fragmented emotionally, and always on some surface, meaning either the floor itself, standing, or a bed, a couch, a chair, a seat on a car, airplane. In other words, there is never a time, and it's not physically possible for there to ever be a time, that we are not on some surface because of gravity. Gravity is not something we think about ever, generally, unless you're in a science class. But 100% of the time, because of gravity, we are falling onto some surface. We are being, pulled toward the center of Earth, and we are being caught by the surfaces that we are falling onto. Now, what does this have anything to do with resistance? Well, as I said, we are a skeleton on a surface 100% of the time. And in the Alexander technique, we learn that we are kind of subconsciously in a state of contracting our muscles, not knowing it, in a fight or flight state, kind of a permanent set one. And fight or flight, I mean, if you're sitting somewhere right now and suddenly there was an alarm that went off in your house, a smoke detector or, some kind of fire alarm, you would notice your body going into this kind of fight or flight, startle reflex response mode. Now, this is what the Alexander technique teaches us, that we're kind of, as adults or young adults, always in this reactive state. And reactive is the right word. It's a state of reactivity that we don't realize we're in, muscularly. But the thing about this muscular contraction is not only can we come out of it, you can feel yourself, again, if you pretended that an alarm went off, you would feel yourself muscle up in reaction to that. And then if someone said, well, now come out of it, you'd come out of it. And if I said, now come out of it, particularly in your face and your head and your neck and your shoulders and your arms and your hands and your back and your hips and your legs and your feet, you would see the difference between these two states, either squeezing your skeleton or not squeezing your skeleton, because the only thing underneath these muscles is a skeletal structure. Not talking about all of our organs and all the fluids in our body. So the interesting thing, and the reason I bring all this up, the interesting thing about that muscular contraction is that not only is it a form of muscularly bracing and kind of resisting the surface, the piece of furniture that we are naturally falling onto, this muscular pickup makes us feel like we could flee or levitate or leave the surface or leave the space we're in physically, which of course we can't unless we walk away. But the muscular contraction itself doesn't make us leave. But that's why fight or flight is such an interesting concept, because it feels like we want to flee, fight or flee. And some people use the word freeze as well, which is very indicative. It's very indicative of the muscular contraction, because basically it feels like we're locking up, we're freezing. It doesn't matter how you think of this. The point is, the organism goes into this reactive state of muscular pickup, muscular contraction, even if it's just something simple like, oh, I have to get out of the chair, there's kind of this muscular inner preparation. You can look at this so simply, again, as a skeleton on a surface, either squeezing or coming out of that squeezing. Again, very useful to include the head, neck, and shoulder area. But what is interesting about this muscular contraction, and this is something that is not necessarily or at all typically taught in something like the Alexander technique, but it was something that my Alexander teacher relayed to me because she had a history in Eastern education Buddhism, Hinduism, and branches of that, offshoots, is that when the organism is in that muscular contraction, that habitual reactive state that we as humans are all in starting at a certain age, we're not there starting at a certain age because we don't do that when we're very, very young. But that contraction puts us into a state of thinking. And it overlaps very well with training in things like Zen Buddhism and other Eastern, aspects of Buddhism and the work of Ramana Maharshi, Advaita Vedanta, all of that focusing on the I thought and the feeling of a self and the discussion of the ego from the perspective of Eastern practices. And what I want to say is that the muscular contraction we're talking about that Alexander highlighted in his work and that I mentioned was mentioned to me by my Alexander teacher, that muscular contraction puts us into a state of thought. And the common kind of thought we relate to, which is the anxious kind, the worrying kind, the wanting kind, the desiring kind, all the things that are discussed in Eastern practices. And this is where the word resistance is so interesting, because it kind of bridges the gap between how we think of the physical world versus the emotional world, right? Because Charlotte is really talking about something emotional here. I feel a lot of resistance to my feelings that I can't even name. So resistance, in truth, though, is a muscular contraction, a bracing against not only the surface that we're on, that's taking our weight, that we don't have to muscularly resist because it's naturally taking our weight. We are not needing to support our own weight. It's naturally supported by gravity and the surface underneath us, which is essentially planet Earth. But it's also a sense of resisting the present moment. And you will hear teachers like Eckhart Tolle referring to this frequently, or someone like Alan Watts. And in the Alexander technique, as a teacher that I am, I also will bring somebody's attention to the fact that there's a sense, this rushedness in the body, this impatience, this rushedness. I don't want to be here. I don't want to be in this situation. I don't want to be doing this. I want to be doing something else. All of this is also indicative of the feeling of resistance, right? So let's go with that for a moment. I am resisting the conditions of the present moment. And in Charlotte's case, the perhaps resistance of the conditions of the present moment include some kind of feeling that she is suspicious lurks underneath the mental block, perhaps, or the mysterious sense of, I don't even know what those feelings are. But I'm going to say that whether or not there are feelings or, again, like information, messaging that exists somewhere in memory that is not surfacing, it's something of the past. So it doesn't really matter for the present moment except for the fear of it, right? Which we're making a loop here. The resistance because there's fear. The way I've been educated and the way it helps me in this new work is that resistance is always simply a muscular contraction, a squeezing of one's skeleton. And if you keep it simple like that, and you come out of that contraction, especially in the head, neck, face, shoulder, mouth, jaw area, you will notice that when you come out of that muscular contraction, that bracing, there is no thought. And so there is no feeling of muscles, because feeling muscles is really just muscle tension. And there is no feeling emotionally. There is no thought going on in the mind. Now, some people might argue, well, feeling my emotions is a different thing than thinking. I would disagree with that. because I would break things down to that there's either this muscular contraction that is bringing on all the sensations that we relate to and identify with as thoughts, emotions, feelings, pain even. Now, pain is related to this, but it's related to this if we're talking about emotional pain. If we're talking about emotional pain, then it really is just interesting to notice that if you come out in a full-bodied way of your muscular stress reaction, you will notice for that moment there's no sensation of anything. There's no sensation of consciousness. There's no sensation of an I, an ego, a feeling, an emotion, a thought, any of it. If we're purely talking about physical pain, meaning like nerve pain or, pain from diseases that I don't know enough about pain in this way on a scientific level in terms of, different diseases or illnesses cause different kinds of pain, or obviously trauma to the body, like if you were shot or you were electrocuted or, various kinds of systemic damage that puts the body into a certain kind of reactive state that, like any animal, that isn't about the conscious feeling or thinking process that is added to that. Now, this is a way bigger topic than I have knowledge about, and I think even general science doesn't yet have information enough about what people talk about in the study of consciousness about the topic of pain. But what I'm simplifying here is that, and bear with me if it feels like it's been very circular, is that even if you have been in a car accident, let's say, and suddenly your body is just thrown into a state of physical pain, and on top of that is all of what we identify with as emotional pain, meaning all of the thoughts that get triggered in addition to that about the status of the situation, or just sometimes we react emotionally just to the pain we're feeling physically. And this is hard to break down, but even in the simplest terms, like, I can't believe I'm in this state. I can't believe I'm feeling pain. I hate feeling pain. Pain is terrible. I don't want to be in pain. Now, what I'm trying to say here is that there is a muscular contraction in the body. It's like, it's a defense system. It's a layer of armor, protective measure, this fight or flight state that we go into. But what happens in the fight or flight state, is really just a muscular contraction. And I'm not saying that, if it was a horrible situation physically, that it would be easy to come out of it. But one could still learn to notice that they are either squeezing their muscles everywhere in their body or they are not. In the same way you would if an alarm went off and you were not in an emergency state, but an alarm went off, your whole body would go into this reactive fight or flight state, muscular pickup. Now, when something terrible happens to the body, like a car accident, if you come out of, or even when you're just walking and you fall on the ice, if you automatically come out of that reactive muscular pickup, you will notice that the part of your mind that is also reacting to everything that's going on, in other words, the conditions of the present moment, even if you're having an argument with someone and you're locking up and freezing up and you're panicking in your mind, a lot of it is exacerbated by this muscular contraction, this resistance. So getting back to Charlotte's question, if we looked at resistance as purely a muscular contraction, and you came out of the muscular contraction and you noticed that for that moment, there was no emotional awareness at all. There was no thinking going on. There was no story. There was no emotional reaction to anything. Much like Byron Katie's question, her two questions, how do you react when you believe the thought or have the thought such and such? Who would you be without the thought? So my question is, in the moment, Charlotte, when you're having this sensation, this experience of, I feel a lot of resistance to my feelings that I can't even name, if you came out of a muscular contraction, again, particularly in the upstairs of your body, notice that there is no story at that moment. And truthfully, the question or the statement, I feel a lot of resistance to my feelings, is a story. It's a thought. It's just a thought. Feelings that I can't even name. These are thoughts, right? And in Byron's work, it would be, who would I be without the thought? In my work, it is, who would you be? Or I don't have to ask that question. The point is, notice when you come out of muscular pickup, when you come out of the squeezing of your skeleton. Now, this is something to be studied a little bit and practiced. But again, you can use an example as if a fire alarm suddenly went off. You notice that pickup in the body. Now, I say, assume you're always in that pickup. That's what Alexander discovered, is after a certain age, we kind of lock up in a permanent state in this set fight or flight status. And until somebody brings your attention to it, you wouldn't even know you were in it, and you wouldn't even know you could come out of it. But as I said, my teacher in particular, because she had a background in Eastern work that maybe overlapped with this, pointed out to me that not only is thinking the biggest muscular contraction, but that when one comes out of, well, you know what? To be honest, I'm not sure she was the one to state this, but maybe I just discovered it on my own over time. But that when you come out of muscular contraction, there is no thought going on. That means there are no feelings going on. That means that this particular story that Charlotte is very familiar with doesn't exist in that moment. Now, people would discuss this in different ways. They'd say, well, okay, whatever, so it goes away for that moment, but that doesn't mean it still doesn't exist and isn't lurking under the surface. And that is true, because we all have our conditioned minds and our story that's very particular to us and our life experience that goes on whenever we are in this muscular contraction, which is most of the time, unless you study something like the Alexander technique, or you take what I'm saying here and you just run with it and play with, wow, I could just come out of that. I could notice that I'm naturally on a surface. I don't have to hold up my weight. I don't have to brace against support. I don't have to try to hold myself up. And you can notice that muscular contraction is the same thing that is our reactivity to the various events going on in our day and the thoughts we have. And so you could practice that and get good at it, and also think, well, how important can this feeling, emotional thought feeling, be if I could just come out of it that easily? But nevertheless, if we have had certain kinds of traumatic events in our life, I mean any kind, absolutely any kind, it can be something that a dynamic with a parent or a friend or a person in our life, if we've been abused in any way, emotionally, physically, psychologically, all of it. It is true that over time, information might come to us more easily if we have the aid of a psychotherapist, a social worker, or not. A conversation with someone could trigger it, or all of a sudden you could have a dream, have a memory, and like, oh, wow, I didn't know that happened. That makes sense as to why I always have these feelings. Now, all of this is tied together, but the point is that the feeling of resistance is wholly, purely a muscular contraction. And when you come out of that, there's nothing to fear, because what's underneath that is still your skeleton on a surface. Is why I say you're a skeleton on a surface. You're either squeezing or not squeezing, but you're always in the space. And the fear is wrapped around somehow, if we feel what we think we're afraid of feeling, we're going to be thrown back into that state of whatever happened to us, perhaps, that is making us feel this way. And that can't occur, because whatever happened in the past is over. It lives in the past. Now, that doesn't mean a memory of it would not be scary or frightening or terrifying to discover something that happened that your mind had blocked out, or your brain had blocked the information flow to your consciousness, your conscious mind. But sometimes it surfaces and it's not as scary as we thought it would be. Sometimes it is useful to have a therapist or a friend or someone you feel safe with, or even just a pillow, to comfort us in the moment when information is surfacing. But I would bet a lot of money that just playing with the word resistance in and of itself as a form of muscular contraction, a fight or flight reactivity, because that state alone has nothing to do most of the time with any of these other issues that might surface, there is something about muscular contraction. You can play with this yourself to experiment and see. That leaves us in a permanent state or a constant habitual state of discomfort, dis-ease, emotional and muscular discomfort and dis-ease. It triggers our stories of self-doubt and self-judgment and not being good enough and not feeling like we're ever going to get what we want, not satisfying our needs, not fulfilling our desires. All of it, for some reason, gets triggered when, and it might have something to do, with these particular muscles around the skull and the spine, in the neck, and the face, and the throat, and the mouth, and the eyes, and the whole thing up there that somehow triggers anxious thinking. And my teacher, and I don't know where she got this information, had once upon a time said to me, and I'll never forget it, that when there is compression around the brainstem and the skull, or just the relationship of the skull, the brainstem, and the rest of the spine, it triggers the individual into a state of anxiety. And again, I don't know where she got that. I don't remember exactly how she phrased it, but it tied into the rest of our education in the Alexander technique about this compression, and the thing that she had relayed to me about, or that I somehow took from what she said, that thinking was the biggest muscular contraction, that it triggers thought. And we each have our own habits of thought that are particular to our life and everything that has happened to us and our memories and all of that. So I hope you can follow and put together all of this. My advice to Charlotte and anybody feeling this kind of thing is to just play around with, experiment with, noticing that you're on a surface, notice that you're a whole body, touch your head and notice that it's part of the rest of you. Then say to yourself, I'm a skeleton on a surface, and I'm either squeezing my skeleton, squeezing my body, or I'm not. And when you're not, just notice that not only does your body feel a little better for the moment, but thoughts go away for that time. And thoughts in my work include everything that would ever be messaging. Thoughts include emotions, feelings, beliefs, opinions, bad feelings, all of it. So with that, I leave you, and I look forward to our next time together. Thank you for listening to the Q&A series with Jill Eng, Mindful Reality. And if you are interested in coaching sessions or personalized recordings, please refer to the website at jillengmindfulreality.com. Thanks, and see you next time.